Thank you so much. I didn't hear what you said, but I trust it was all good things. Oh, it wasn't. We're very people with us to discuss a very important topic. I think it is especially important in the Norwegian context because in the Norwegian context, a lot of the Israel debate, because that's what it is, it's a debate about Israel. It's about finger pointing and who's to blame. And that's fine, that's okay, but it doesn't really point forward. So what we're going to try to do today is to talk about the different actors in the region and the conflict, what their agents is, what their constraints are, and whether there is a future out there somewhere. I want to start with you, Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. I think he was introduced to you. You have a fascinating story. You can say a little bit about it yourself. But you are a Palestinian from Gaza, and you are not by any means pro-Israel. I wouldn't say, from what I just want to be. You're pro-Palestinian, and you have a very different perspective from the common narrative in Norway. Tell us about how do you approach this conflict as a Palestinian? What are your priorities? What do you think are the important things that need to be done to move forward?
Well, good to be with you. Thank you all for being here. Really, really grateful for your presence. Honored to be in your company. And as I always like to briefly just share, I'm speaking here as Ahmed. I've never claimed to speak on behalf of the Palestinian people, and I very much so feel confident that what I share is something that many Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, but also in the diaspora, in the English-speaking world, do think and believe, but have a hard time verbalizing. And I want you to be skeptical of anybody who claims to speak on behalf of the Palestinian people or who claims to have somehow a monopoly on what that represents. So I am in this space, and very much so because as you shared, I do, though I ideally would like to identify as pro-humanity, pro-peace, I very much so am pro the Palestinian people and their just and urgent aspirations for freedom and emancipation and progress and prosperity. That is a driver of my work. That is a motivating factor in what I do this work. And while I want to build bridges with the Jewish community, the Zionist community, the pro-Israel spaces, Israelis, that is in service of the interests of the Palestinian people. I've become very alarmed over the last decade in general, but especially over the last 3 years following October 7th, by the state of what you would call, quote, pro-Palestine advocacy. I feel that there's a lot more to being pro-Palestine than simply being anti-Israel. We, I think, have largely an anti-Israel movement, not one that is actually pro-Palestine, because being pro-Palestine means listen to the inconvenient Palestinian voices in Gaza, including, but not limited to, those who are against Hamas. And right now, I would dare to say that that is the majority of the population in the Gaza Strip, whether it's the consequences of October 7th, whether it's the totality of Hamas's governance over the last 20 years, whether it's the arc of Hamas's rise and ascent to power, and hopefully now we're seeing their gradual and slow and grinding demise. They've basically stunted the growth and the evolution and the development of the Palestinian National Project. They've set the Palestinian people's aspirations back by 3 decades since the Oslo. We're in Oslo. We love the Oslo Peace Accords. I love the Oslo Peace Accords because I actually got to experience the tail end of the Oslo Peace Accords. I got to experience Gaza's short-lived international airport. I flew into Gaza in 1999 and in 2000. Can you imagine just uttering those words right now? Gaza and an airport. The Palestinian Airlines, if you go to my social media, all of my social media is that Boeing 727 that I flew on. And I actually, in old age, I got to know the captain. I'm personal friends with the captain that flew me into Gaza. And the air traffic controller who lives in Gaza right now, who directed the flight to land into Gaza. We had Palestinian Authority passports instead of the Egyptian travel documents. And then fast forward to the Second Intifada, and one of the themes that I speak of is Palestinian agency. I have two main theses, and we'll come back to them later, and I want to transition to Shany here. And I mentioned those in my recently published book, Hamas and its 2 million hostages. The first central theme that I always discuss is that, of course, there's an imbalance in power dynamics between Israel and the Palestinian people. However, within said imbalance exists plenty of space for Palestinian agency, responsibility, and accountability. This is not blaming the victims. This is not self-hatred. This is actually the first step to empowering the Palestinian people. This is something that is absent from what the Norwegian government and the Norwegian society and the pro-Palestine movement here says, what the pro-Palestine movement writ large in the Western world says, and what a lot of folks, as they talk about the Palestinian people, they don't assign or prescribe any agency to them to say that, you know what, Arafat walking away from 2000 in the Camp David peace deal, he didn't say no totally, but he didn't say yes. That was a choice. Hamas basically weaponizing Gaza and turning Gaza into a citadel for rockets and missiles and tunnels and terror under the guise of resistance and wasting and squandering tens of thousands of lives, tens of billions of dollars. That was a choice. Launching October 7th was a choice. So that's thesis number one. And then thesis number two is that there is not going to be any kind of a resolution to the Israel and Palestine conflict. However much we believe in radical pragmatism, being practical, etc., unless and until Gaza is addressed, until we make up for the last 20 years of arrested development, in which Gaza actually evolves into becoming the pride and joy of the Palestinian people, a successful role model of compelling Palestinian self-governance, what an occupation-free West Bank can and should look like. Until and unless that happens, we're never going to get the majority of Israelis on board with two-state solutions. I don't think we're ever going to get most of the Arabs and the international community to pump the kind of resources and the support needed to, once again, have a massive push for Palestinian statehood. So that's kind of a central focus of what I'm doing nowadays.
We're going to delve into a lot of the details here a little bit later on, but let's move to you, Shany Mor. You have a slightly different perspective. Also, please give a little bit about your background for the audience. But I just want to hear with you two questions. The first one is, as an Israeli, how do you look at Palestinian agency? I think it's a sort of a problem in this conflict that sometimes spokespeople for both sides point to the other side as the one that has a choice, whereas your own side just, does what it has to do, or is forced to do in a sense. So give us your perspective on Palestinian agency, but also on Israeli agency, because there is a tendency in this conflict, but not only in this conflict, that we in the West and in Norway, we view Western countries, and including Israel, as having agency, and other countries as being just responding to events. But Israel is also, of course, responding to events constrained by both popular opinion and other things. So tell us about the degrees of freedom that you feel that the Israeli government, but also the Israeli polity outside of the Netanyahu government has. There is this question of whether there was an effort to actually build a Palestinian state. 15 years ago, there was a process going on in the West Bank. And there is an impression among many that Netanyahu, to his best ability, stymied that attempt. So give us your perspective.
Sure, I think there's a lot of intersecting questions there all at once.
I know, sorry.
Netanyahu, for all of his faults, did not conspire to bring the Palestinian leadership to reject an offer of statehood in 2000 at Camp David. He wasn't in power at the time, he wasn't even a member of parliament, nor did he do the same in 2001 at Taba, nor did he do the same in 2007 at Annapolis, or in 2008 in the oil mill Abbas talks. Nor, by the way, did he in 2014 in the talks led by John Kerry, where he basically accepted the American bridging proposal, later denied it to his own public, and it was the Palestinian side that rejected it. We can analyze each of these rejections of statehood from the Palestinian leadership as micro events. We can look at the personalities, we can look at the various political pressures, we can look at the circumstances at each one of those decision notes, 2000, 2001, 2007, 2008, 2013, 2014, and even going back to 1947. And there's a historical interest in doing that. What's interesting to me, present company excluded, and not that many, is that none of these, particularly focusing on the ones in this century since 2000, were in any way criticized or protested inside Palestinian politics, and certainly in the larger epistemic community that you know better probably than I do here in Oslo of what's considered pro-Palestinian activism. It is to say, it's not that my complaint here or my argument is not that there was not a majority saying that this was the wrong decision, whether not out of sympathy for me, but on purely instrumental grounds. That is that there wasn't even a minority. You simply cannot find the opinion piece, the professor, the spontaneous protest, the little NGO, anyone who said this was a mistake. Not in real time. I mean, even I wrote in 2023, before October 7th. I had no idea October 7th was going to happen. But I wrote an article in February of 2023, basically saying that I thought another Israeli-Palestinian explosion, at least on the order of magnitude of what happened in 2000, was nearly inevitable. I analyzed and I pinned much of the blame on the Israeli side. It was the side I knew more about, apropos agency. But I wrote a little bit about the Palestinian side as well. And I mentioned in that article that it wasn't just that in 2000 it wasn't a controversial act to reject statehood and instead to initiate this nihilistic suicide violence. It's that in the ensuing 23 years, nobody even looked back and said, in retrospect, this was a catastrophe. We could today be celebrating the 23rd Independence Day of Palestine. We could be flying out of the airport in Dahlia in Gaza, to say nothing of the 68th, 69th, 71st anniversary of statehood had not been rejected in 47. That to me is frustrating in terms of the national movement itself. And it's deeply frustrating in terms of the international movement that calls itself pro-Palestine. This is not a movement that is pro-anything, and I think this is Ahmed's frustration with it as well. He puts it in very polite terms on stage. You guys should hear him talk in private, by the way. But he says it very delicately and very, very diplomatically, and I understand his frustration and share it entirely. I don't think it's even one of attaching agency just to the Israeli side. I think a great deal of the pro-Palestine self-described movement is almost a religious revival in the West. It is a movement. It is a movement that centers its politics on the idea of the irredeemable evil of the Jewish state. It's not a political or diplomatic analysis. It is really at the level of a theology. As for your question about what's happening in the policies that Israel pursued, in 2005, with the disengagement, Israel, maybe not even deliberately, created something of a natural experiment in the territories that were occupied in 67. It had three models, essentially, that were created. In Gaza, you had a situation where there was no Israeli civilian presence and no Israeli military presence. We can explore what the results of that were. In the northern West Bank, people forget that in 2005 we withdrew from 4 settlements out of about 120. So it's a very small number. But the 4 were not just 4 random settlements. They were 4 settlements that were around one Palestinian city, Jenin. When those 4 settlements were withdrawn in 2005, it was an entire sector of the West Bank that was essentially settlement-free. So you had in the northern West Bank an area with no Israeli civilian presence, but full freedom of action for the army, something that looks more like just an occupation. And in the rest of the West Bank, you had the status quo before, which is lots of Israeli civilian presence, about 120 settlements, and full freedom of action of the IDF. So you had three different interim status quos with three very different results. From the perspective of the West Bank settler movement, the seeming success of the model in the northern West Bank was a political catastrophe. The thing that scared them was that the public would see that you could actually have a better security situation without the day-to-day friction that the settlement enterprise causes. And they put an enormous political effort into undoing that and made many, many efforts to resettle that area, all of which until 2020 were beaten back by the IDF. In 2020, there was an interesting change. It's probably beyond the scope of this conversation why there was such a change, but it basically came to an end. And not only that, effectively one of the four settlements has already been reestablished, and the constant presence of Israeli civilians in that area has become a fact of life in the last 5 years. So that the very limited success story of the 2005 engagement has basically been undone out of concern that that success could possibly be replicated elsewhere by a very small but very determined internal interest group in Israeli domestic politics.
Well, that's interesting. You point to one of the freedoms of action that the Israeli government has, which is at the same time one that is hardly ever discussed in this broader question abroad. In Norway, I don't think we've had that discussion at all about that particular distinction in the West Bank.
But it's obviously not something that's desirable in the long term. I mean, in a two-state solution, would you have a foreign army having the freedom of action to come and arrest terrorists and things like that? It's not a long term. But in the interim, in the absence of a peace agreement, it is the least bad situation. What happened in Gaza instead is that we left in 2005 and left also our military presence, including our military presence that was on the border with Egypt. That within 2 years becomes a Hamas statelet, and the ensuing, 2 decades after that bring us directly to the 7th of October.
I'm going to move to you, Alex. Thank you, Shany. We're going to come back to all these questions. Alex Vatanka, you have a slightly different background. You can also give us a few.
To make a decision. Do they want to stay the course? Do they want to continue being resistance? Because frankly, the axis of resistance, if Hamas was supposed to destroy Israel, guess what? It didn't happen. And I don't think anybody's going to bet money that militarily any of these Arab militant groups that Iran supports are going to defeat Israel. It has been now tried for decades and decades by Arabs, now by Iran. Maybe the Turks are going to give it a go in the future, but so far hasn't worked out. So maybe the solution that you want to support, and probably that's where I'm not in the advocacy field. I speak more of an analyst, but just looking at it objectively, the two-state solution, I understand right now is not the day to talk about two-state solution, but probably where in an ideal world we want to go. And that's the sort of thing an Iranian regime that puts Iranian interests first would, I think, be going. Because the ideological obsession of the Islamic Republic basically has not worked out. And I am someone, and I don't shy away from saying this, I don't think political Islam has done anything good for anyone in the Middle East. I think, in fact, the biggest victim of political Islam is the religion of Islam, if you will. People have turned their backs on the religion itself because of the failures of governance. And when these groups, these entities like the Islamic Republic, fail to deliver basic necessities for the citizens. So the regime right now in Tehran has an opportunity to say, we use groups like Hamas and Hezbollah to fight the Israelis 1,000 kilometers over there on the Mediterranean. That was the whole plan. We spend money, we give him arms, we give him technical assistance. So we fight this ideological enemy called Israel over there. But guess what happened? After October 7th, the Israelis said, thank you, but we're not going to just sit there and watch it anymore. So they took the fight to Iran. So the table's been turned around. The idea of axis of resistance and forward defense is no longer what it used to be before October 7th. And now Iran really is at a crossroad. Do we continue investing in this issue of fighting them through proxies, or do we actually have another hard look of Israel? You don't have to love Israel to recognize its right its right to exist. And then you go about helping the Palestinians in their cause for freedom and dignity. But you can do that outside the sort of militant framework that Iran has been associated with so long. I don't know which way this Iranian regime will go. Right now, if I had to put money on it, I'd say they'll stay with the proxies for now, with the Hezbollahs of this world, with the Hashd-Shabis of the region. But I don't know how long they can continue to do so, both because the ideology of the Islamic Republic is essentially bankrupt. There are no supporters, or not significant number of supporters. If anybody wants to know what percentage of Iranians support the regime, I will say probably about 15–20%. And I think that's the best guess you're going to get from anybody. There are no obviously scientific data. But the point I'm trying to make is Iran has a choice to make. The regime has a choice to make. And let me leave you with this. This is kind of ironic. The Islamic Republic has spent all this time and money and effort and billions of dollars supporting groups like Hamas, which, by the way, has never really lifted a finger for Iran once. And that's really ironic, because to your point about what are we doing for? What are we doing this for? Is this Iranian national interest? It's not. Iran has no fight in this, or horse or dog in this fight. Iran could stay out of it. There's not an inch in Iranian territory that's occupied by Israel. Iran could stay out of it, and nothing will come out of it. So it's an ideological one, but for that, when I look at the statistics, when I look at the surveys out there, and I see Iranians that are pro-Israel, Iranians who've grown up in the Islamic Republic of Iran are pro-Israel, to me that raises a lot of questions. How? You've been listening to your regime's propaganda for all these decades, and you're still pro-Israel. But here's the thing: they're not necessarily pro-Israel for the sake of Israel. They're against anything the regime is for. And that, I think, is it's in itself the biggest verdict I can bring to you to show you that Iran's Israel policy is in trouble, if you will. But I have no idea where they're going to go. But all I'm saying is the guy who used to run Iran for 37 years is no longer with us. We don't know where his son is. He's still alive. He's hiding.
Cardboard eyes.
Some. We'll find out. But this is one of those pivotal moments in the trajectory of the Islamic Republic in terms of where they can choose to go. I don't know where, but they have a choice to make.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up, Alex. I'm thinking of, like, if we continue with this octopus and tentacles image, I don't really like it, but just for now, if there were to be a two-state solution or any kind of like meaningful, constructive political process with unified Palestinian leadership, where would that leave the axis of resistance and the Iranian influence in the region?
Hopefully much weaker, if not to a point of irrelevance. But I think that's good. That is good for Iran. That's good for the region. The axis of resistance is a terrible model. It's essentially, basically, you have organizations that run however they feel like running their own affairs within states, over the heads of states. Look at Hezbollah in Lebanon. Look at the Hashd-Shaabi in Iraq. Look at the IRGC, the Islamic Revolution Guards Corps in Iran. It's the mothership. It's the state within the state. It's not accountable to anyone. It is essentially a mafia-style operation, which I think, if you believe in sort of normal countries behaving normally, where you have accountability, transparency, you don't necessarily have to be a democracy, but you have a pyramid where the power's at the top and you know how power flows. That doesn't happen in countries where you have these axis of resistance organizations operating. So if there is a two-state solution, if there's a process aimed at a two-state solution, it could just really be an important part of undercutting the Iranian message. By the way, the Iranian message is the Israelis will never give Palestinians a fair deal unless if you fight them. If you neutralize that argument, if you say no, actually the Israelis will, under the right circumstances, agree to a political process, then I think the likes of the Islamic Republic of Iran will have a much tougher time selling what they've been trying to sell for all these years.
That's the question to unlock. Where do you start if you're going to turn a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle? Let's go into that question. I have two questions, I think, for each of you from slightly different perspectives. We talked about Palestinian agency. What can Palestinians do differently? I just want to ask you, what are the
victory? That is to say, it would be nice if Israel could eliminate Hezbollah. But the fact that it has done so much damage in a way that has completely re-engineered Lebanese politics is already a lot. It would be nice if Israel really could topple the regime in Iran. I think that's a bit of a fantasy, a country that we have no border with, that has 90 million people and roughly the land mass of half of Europe. But having done years worth of damage to its nuclear program, its missile program, and some of the very foundations of its power, I think is quite a bit. That's true as well for the Houthis and for other. I don't think the Hamas situation is like that. That's something that is very difficult to articulate both in an internal Israeli context and outside.
It's either there or it's not.
You can't win Hamas on points. The kind of challenge that Hamas presented on October 7th. There's a big denialism, I think, in the West about what October 7th was, what the strategic turn was that Hamas was doing. October 7th was not just an ecstatic orgy of violence. It was, from the perspective of the side that initiated the attack, a moment of incredible optimism that Israel really could be toppled. And it was a promise on their part, by the way, to keep trying. They didn't actually succeed, but there are a few things that could have gone differently on October 7th. I mean, they could have moved a few more kilometers in and captured an Israeli Air Force base. Imagine if they had killed 100 pilots and blown up several fighter planes that day, where we'd be. They could have managed to get Hezbollah to join the war that morning. Hezbollah was an armed force much better trained than they were, with a much more well-developed invasion plan for the north of Israel. There are a lot of things that could have been different. There is no situation where Israel can go back to a territorial army of almost 50,000 men, larger than the territorial armies of most NATO countries, simply on a fence by several of its large cities and its rural communities there. Israel can't possibly deter any Hamas or non-Hamas attempts to do the same thing without exacting a very, very high price from the force that attacked it on the 7th and leaving it decisively defeated. It was impossible to do that in the immediate aftermath of October 7th for three very big reasons. By far the biggest one was the hostages. As long as Hamas was holding 251 Israeli hostages, there was no way militarily you could just come in and defeat them. That was a brilliant move on their part. The second and third reason weren't as important, but they had an impact as well. The second reason was that inside the Israeli government, you had a very small but very powerful faction with a real veto that obviously wasn't happy about the October 7th attack, but saw the possibility of a large Israeli-Palestinian war as a way of achieving a whole bunch of goals that they have, particularly in the West Bank. None of that's realistic. None of that is close to any decision-making. But the fact that there were people saying these things, the fact that some of them are ministers in government, the fact that some of them are powerful and influential voices in the security establishment is a burden for Israel in its conduct of the war. And the third factor was the enormous edifice of international hypocrisy that created entirely bespoke rules for Israel's conduct of the war, rules that exist nowhere else, in no other theater of conflict, and that were invented on the fly and are ironically called often international law. The law implies that something is general. So, for example, I don't know of any other war in history or any other war that's happening now where one of the belligerent parties was responsible for the logistics and supplies of the other side. I don't know of any other war anywhere in the world where the international humanitarian community mobilizes to not let civilians leave the theater. I don't know of any other war anywhere in the world where one of the parties has to supply electricity to the side that it's fighting. I don't know of any other war anywhere in the world where a priori one side has to commit that any territory it conquers, that it's not going to conquer any territory. That doesn't even have the leverage of threatening the other side with losing territory that it's attacked from. None of these things exist anywhere. To say nothing of the obscene reinvention of terms that used to mean something, like genocide, like famine, like collective punishment, only as part of the weird fantasy that so many in the West have of envisioning the victims of the Shoah as somehow perpetrators of the same crimes. So in that situation, Israel's hands were tied. But like I said, there's not an equal weight between those three things. The first and most important one was the hostage situation. The hostage situation is over now. If the ceasefire falls apart, assuming no new hostages are taken, it's a very different dynamic in terms of how military operations will be carried out. The only thing that can interfere with that now is if the next step in the Board of Peace and the Comprehensive Plan goes into effect and the International Stabilization Force comes in. From the Israeli perspective, there is no reason to agree to the ISF or to any further steps in the Comprehensive Plan being enacted unless the first stage of it, which is the disarmament and the decommissioning of weapons, happens. There will be an enormous pressure on Israel, as there was in the 1990s in Oslo, to say, oh, you can't be serious. You need to move to the next stage. You can't actually expect the other side to live up to its commitments exactly before you withdraw from territory. Don't make an issue of this. What are you really threatened by this arms or this capacity? From the Israeli side, there has to be a solid no on that. You want us to withdraw, in the next stage, withdraw from the yellow line after the disarmament has happened. Because the moment we move on to the ISF, we're essentially doing the same thing, obviously, from a humanitarian perspective, very different, but we're putting ourselves in the same limits as what the hostage situation was, which was we can no longer carry out effective offensive military action. Our only leverage on Hamas is gone.
What I've seen from some of the more critical voices in the Israeli debate is that people like, Tomo murder, they will put up these people. They will ask, what is the strategy for Gaza? There is an international stabilization force, it's disarmed. Okay, what happens 10 years from now? If there is no process, how do you prevent some sort of entity similar to Hamas from at some point re-emerging, maybe during different regional dynamics? Is there freedom of action on the Israeli part to say, if Hamas is gone, let's use that moment to, reunite the two areas, bring in a common political process? Is that space available in Israeli politics?
Right. So let's think of the possible scenarios, and just because I'm going to list scenarios doesn't mean that there's something that I haven't thought of, right? But the possible, the sort of the four most available cognitively scenarios for Gaza are kind of Mogadishu, just a complete collapse. I don't see how that serves Israel's interests. I don't need to explain why that's bad. There's further Hamas control, which I think is catastrophic for all sides. There's direct Israeli administration, as there was from 1967 to 1994. I don't think that's a possibility. And in terms of the manpower and the cost of doing that, this is not an endeavor that Israel can take on. It actually was comparatively easy to do it, certainly from 1967 to 1987, but even from 1987 to 1994, the years of the first Intifada and leading up to Gaza. Israel does not have the manpower or the resources for governing Gaza. The fourth scenario is that Gaza goes back to being under the Palestinian Authority. The way I've set it up, it sounds like the solution is obvious. Well, obviously the fourth one is the least bad one, right? Why not go for that? The fourth scenario has a lot of risk and a lot of downsides for Israel. Particularly for the right-wing governing coalition, it has a very obvious downside, which is that it not only could fail, but that it could succeed and put Israel in a position where in 5 years or more, it's under pressure to make much more substantial withdrawals on the West Bank. Thank you very much. That you can guess is not a scenario that I'm particularly worried about, but that obviously worries the people who are in power right now in Israel and will be in power for at least the next 2 months. But there's many other reasons to worry about that scenario too. There are many potential downsides there. I've set it up so that that one appears to have the least bad. And I think that's probably right. It is the least bad of the four. I mean, if the other alternatives are Mogadishu, Hamas, and direct Israeli rule, then yes, bringing back the Palestinian Authority is the least bad of the four options.
How about the Kosovo model? How about something that entails the international forces an international coalition that actually creates stability, maybe not one for one, because it was some considered a separatist region, etc. But why not consider something like that in which international control can actually usher in a successful path to self-autonomy?
International, like a Kosovo model would only be relevant after Hamas has been disarmed. If the international force that comes in becomes effectively human shields for continuing Hamas presence, and if Israel gets the same, I used to call it the avocado model of deterrence, right? If Israel gets the same avocado model about rocket fire, whatever, which is you're going to respond to one rocket, you're going to do this because of one kidnapping, you're going to really blow this up over one infiltration and terrorist attack, you're going to get upset about this, we will find ourselves in the same path that we were in the 1990s and with Hamas. If there is a full disarmament of Hamas first, then I think that's a way to go. Although even then, I think the pressure will be, why not in such a situation transition into, and I don't think we have a reason to say no, except for the ideological right. Why not transition into making this the basis for state building on the West Bank as well? I'm okay with that. I suspect that there's a good likelihood that Israel will have a governing coalition very soon that will be okay with that, even if it can't say so publicly. I don't want another UNIFIL. UNIFIL enters southern Lebanon and essentially becomes a force multiplier, first for the PLO and then for Hezbollah. That's a disaster for us.
Let's continue the conversation about agency. What's your view on this? How important would it have been even for the war that we've been seeing now, if Israel early on in the conflict sort of promised, if we root out Hamas, this is the path forward? And how important do you think it is today, or is it not important? Is this rather a thing that is that aspect of the conflict in Palestine?
Well, they're very much so. I mean, this is one of my many critiques in the Israeli conduct of the war, which also includes the unnecessary, overwhelming application of firepower that's unexplained, that led to the destruction of both of my childhood homes and the killing of dozens of my immediate and extended family members, despite having very robust relations with Israeli defense and political echelons. I still can't get answers to this day. It provided dates, locations, coordinates, times, descriptions, and there's zero explanations as to why that has happened. And those things matter. What some might deem as an operational mistake or something that I can't, that's a bunch of people's families. And that happened to, I believe, thousands of people. So in addition to the conduct of the war itself, the incentive infrastructure, I mean, yes, the war in Iraq ultimately was a failure, but there were chapters of the war in Iraq where General David Petraeus and others who, instead of just turning this into a pure war or a pure kinetic operation, it was a comprehensive counterinsurgency, counterterrorism operation, and it very much so incorporated incentive structures. How did we get rid of most of Al-Qaeda in the Anbar province, the Sunni triangle, Anbar, Ramadi, and Fallujah in western Iraq in 2006? That was virtually a no-go zone for even the U.S. military. We went to the tribes and some of the local leaders of the communities in there, and the U.S., we as the United States, and pretended to actually care about their well-being and offered not just cash payments, but there was actually a political horizon that short-term, here's cash, here's weapons, you guys kick Al-Qaeda out of your community. Some of these fighters actually gave up on being Al-Qaeda members. They joined these tribes, these awakening councils, the Sahawat, the Sons of Iraq. We have a mutual friend who was part of that movement. Sorry, I pointed at a friend in the audience. And then the horizon is that you get to be integrated as part of, not quite semi-autonomous, but as part of like a Sunni bloc in the Iraqi security infrastructure. And Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki in Iraq axed that completely. In 2011, we saw massive protests in Western Iraq. 2 years later, basically a lot of those guys, the cash dried up, the US had left, and a lot of them became ISIS. So I think that should be a cautionary tale to a certain extent about the lack of a political horizon, such that I do believe that it is possible. I mean, to your earlier question, is it possible to get rid of Hamas? I think absolutely 100%. I dispute the notion. I know that you rightly point out to the lack of vociferous, strong, open debate, introspection, and that is part of what I'm trying to do, the agency and the accountability for a point of view. But what I dispute is that there's an abundance at the informal level within Palestinian society. There is an abundance. You speak to any Palestinian, one-on-one certainly, and many in Gaza, they will tell you how dumb the Second Intifada was. They will tell you how stupid it was for Arafat not to accept the 2000 deal. They will tell you how incredibly unintelligent it was that we squandered the opportunity in 2005. They will speak of Hamas's infiltration of UNRWA, of Hamas's use of the international community to try to entrench its rule. It's like, this is the disconnect that I'm speaking of, is that I'm not a rocket scientist. Like, what I'm saying is not such a novelty in Palestinian community, in the Palestinian community per se. What is perhaps unusual about what I'm saying is that I'm very loud and unapologetic about it, and I will get in people's face about it, because I think we are now facing an apocalyptic, potentially, the potential end of the Palestinian national project. And B, is that I want to formalize this self-critique. I don't want it to just be informal conversations over tea or over social media. I want this to be part of the Palestinian political life, Palestinian culture, part of the Palestinian ethos. You don't think Palestinians argue just as much as Jews do? The 2 Jews, 7 opinions. It's like 2 Palestinians, 1,000 opinions, for goodness sake. But so with that in mind, Hamas can 1,000% be eliminated. I don't care about eliminating their ideology. If I hear one more expert in Washington, D.C. that'll get in front of CNN, Fareed Zakaria, and tell you cannot get rid of the ideology from that. Who gives a shit? The Nazis are still an ideology 80, 85 years later. What I care about is, do they control territory? Do they have the ability to wage war? Do they have control of resources? I don't care about Hamas's ideology per se, but to me, the measure of Hamas's defeat in the short term are the 3 of 4 mentioned metrics. And I think all of those 3 we're well halfway through in terms of achieving that. Then there comes the question, which actually now we have Mohammed Dahlan, who's the former Palestinian security official who's now based in the UAE. He receives support from the UAE. And he's an interesting fellow because, as a child, I actually met him, as a young child, I met him when I was in Gaza, but he was actually part of the premature provocation of Hamas in 2007 that led to the escalation, the apex of the Palestinian civil war in Gaza, when the entirety of the Palestinian Authority knew that their security services were incapable of standing up to Hamas. And I had Palestinian PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization officials pass me then classified documents, now 20 years later, just irrelevant documents, from that time, of them doing internal assessments of all the security services. And basically half of the Palestinian Authority services were about unemployment programs, rather than an actually capable force that could stand up to the battle-hardened, the trained, the well-funded, well-financed, ideological Hamas. And so Mohammed Dahlan, in 2007, he provoked Hamas at the behest following the horrible experiment with the elections, which should have never been held in 2006. At the behest of Condoleezza Rice and the Bush administration, they thought that we could actually basically have the Palestinian Authority, and through this cutout of this quasi-new death militias / security services, we can have a coup over Hamas and get rid of them, That backfired horrendously, and Hamas actually took over. That was June 14th, 2007, the very day of my asylum interview, when I became the first Palestinian from Gaza to receive political asylum in the United States. So, ideological enmity between Dahlan and Hamas. Then Dahlan has a major falling out with Mahmoud Abbas, and the Palestinian president, and the PLO and the Palestinian Authority in 2011, allegedly for theft and corruption and blah, blah, blah. He flees, he goes over to the UAE. And then now, I mean, even before October 7th, going back to 2017 and 2018, his wife, Jalila Dahlan, goes into Gaza. The Egyptians allow her to go into Gaza, full of cash, with suitcases full of cash, similar to what the Qataris were doing. And she's doing massive weddings. She's doing massive educations. They're just passing out cash. And then Hamas all of a sudden is like, oh my God, why do we need to remember our ideological enmity with Mohammed Dahlan, who tried to coup us? Let's actually be buddy-buddy with him against the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Fast forward to right now, as we speak, Mohammed Dahlan is speaking with Nikolai Mladenov, the executive chair. I mean, he's speaking with Jared Kushner, he's speaking with the Americans, he's speaking with a lot of folks behind the scenes, and basically trying to offer an off-ramp for Hamas. Now, I am very radically pragmatic, and like there's an element to me that, like, let's think of Hamas as like this. I don't know. Think of this as Hamas, right? I'm willing to come down to like the bottom, maybe 25% of Hamas, maybe 40 up to 40% maximum of Hamas, and look at like recycling elements of them in terms of administratively, maybe go through some of the security guys that aren't part of the terror operations, that are just civil employees. Fine, I'm willing to have that conversation and go through the vetting. But the guys above that, the guys that were part of the Al-Qassam Brigade, I'm really not down with recycling Hamas into a new body, except Mr. Dahlan now, he's talking and he's offering Hamas, he's part of why Hamas has agreed to this disarmament plan. So you got me here a little bit nervous that on the one hand, we need to be harsh on Hamas. We need to say, no, actually, like, you screwed up, you failed, you abused the democratic process, you launched the single worst day attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, unleashing a catastrophe upon the Palestinian people. You're done. You don't get to choose. You're out of options. Goodbye. All right. So there's one part of me that's very hawkish and unforgiving when it comes to that. Then there's a part of me that's like, we can't also go all the way of the US style de-Baathification in 2003. So can there be that middle ground? Finally, real quick, and I want to go to you. I do believe that in terms of what Israel can do right now, I'm very alarmed. On the one hand, I do think that Hamas is out of option. Hamas is being coerced into accepting the disarmament plan. This isn't about trust. Nobody trusts. I know Nikolai Mladenov personally very well. This is very much so a verifications-based mechanism whereby the Israelis don't have to do anything. There's no withdrawal. There's no commitment to like, you have to do this no matter what, or you have to overlook Hamas violations. It is a very black and white, no gray, no color, no in between, sector by sector, the new Palestinian police force under the Technocratic Committee, and this new internationally led security force with significant US contributions are going to sector by sector verify the tunnel destruction, the collection of arms. They've already removed any references to the distinctions between heavy weapons and light weapons. Most of the atrocities on October 7th were committed by AK-47s, the very light weapons. So Hamas doesn't have very many rockets and RPGs left. So I actually am optimistic that hopefully we're seeing Netanyahu posture for for the elections, and that we do proceed with some level of disarmament in Gaza, because Hamas has a very finite arsenal, and anything to chip away at it is going to be an opportunity.
Okay, I'm going to be brutally honest. I'm not going to pronounce the name of your guy in the UAE. Could you?
Mohammed Dahlan. Just call him Dahlan.
Yeah, I'm not going to pronounce it.
Dahlan.
I'm also going to say, I didn't really know that story at all, and that could be just me. It could pertain to people in the audience, and I think that's fascinating in itself because people who follow this conflict in Norway, they follow it quite intensively. Often they will know a lot of things about Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu and the opposition and everyone, but we don't know anything about this. It's just not on the map because they don't have agency.
Because everything is Israel's fault.
Everything is happening in Israel. Nothing is happening. Well, the US has agency, but no one else. So I think that's just fascinating to see. During this conflict, I've been trying to read English language Egyptian newspapers. And I didn't learn this name, but you learn a lot of things that you don't learn in the reading press. So that's the fascinating thing. I just want to have one follow-up before we move on to this slightly different topic. But we talk about the lack of introspection. And I agree with a lot of what you said, that going back in time for a long time, 47, 48, 67, 73, or a lot of points where you say, why wasn't that choice made? And what's the debate about that choice now? And then, of course, you could explain that by saying, when you're in an existential fight, you don't have the luxury to that kind of self-doubt in a sense. You see it in all wars.
Except we're in an existential fight. We have it from day one.
Yeah, but that's my question, though, and to a certain extent still, because there is a danger on both sides. Of course, Israel is a vibrant democratic state with a lot of opinions, for sure. But is there a danger that as the fight seems more existential, that kind of introspection becomes more difficult, and the parties will themselves start saying, we did not have a choice. That was forced upon us, and there are nothing could have been different than everything is the other party's fault, and we are where we are. Isn't that what sort of locks in a vicious cycle? Is it possible to, how do you preserve that room for, say, radical self-criticism and introspection?
I don't think that's a danger on the Israeli side. The problem on the Israeli side has always been that we attach way too much importance to ourselves, not that we don't see the agency there. We think everything is about us. We think bad things that happen are some kind of punishment for our own misdeeds. We, if anything, don't have quite enough curiosity about the other side. I mean, there's a lot of criticism to be made about the way the internal Israeli political and cultural discussion is run, but on the long lists of criticisms that I would make, I wouldn't add, we don't take our own agency into account. I don't think that's ever been there. And I don't think the lack of that has anything to do with being in an existential struggle. Nobody has ever been in the situation that we found ourselves in 1945 to 48, and yet that was a time of very serious debate, very serious introspection, and a constantly evolving strategy. That's been the case on every day of the state's existence. There has never been in my lifetime and even before an operation, an escalation, or a full-scale war that didn't have people protesting it for one reason or another. Ever. Sometimes with really silly reasons, sometimes with very good ones, sometimes with things that only in retrospect became part of a consensus that took years to understand. There's never been a cultural output in Israel that wasn't about second-guessing what we do. Even the obsession with what a friend of mine calls the moral striptease. It's very funny how much of a consumption that there is of that abroad. I mean, after every war in Israel, there are soldiers and others who give testimony, talk about the moral dilemmas that came up, remember incidents that were difficult for them. That then becomes part of this obsessive discourse about how we're evil in the West. Where is it from? Somebody's been shooting at our forces in these wars. Do their soldiers later write journals about their moral qualms? Do they have memories of the people that they kill? Do they come to Western audiences and put on exhibits in German-speaking countries and in Nordic countries about breaking their silence? For some reason, there's no demand for that.
Wow.
Not quite sure why that is. Yeah. So there's a lot to be said about some of the illnesses that are there in our internal discourse, and we have been through a pretty grave trauma in the last 3 years, which has no doubt done a great distortion on our ability to ask difficult questions and analyze the political situation in a cool and realistic way. But what I've never seen for us is that other problem that we identified. Yeah, go ahead.
Is it really fair to compare one of the top 10 militaries in the world, a nuclear superpower basically in the region, with, I detest Palestinian terrorism, I detest Palestinian militism, but is there even a remote comparison between a state-run massive apparatus that has soldiers? I mean, and they're not just there to shoot at terrorists, they're there to implement horrendous actions and activities in the West Bank, as we see on a daily basis. I'm saying that the totality of some of the experiences, the breaking the silence, so I disagree with some of their stuff because they think I'm not anti-Israel enough, fine. But like, I'm just wondering, is there any comparison though? This is where I do think that imbalance and power dynamics between Israel and the Palestinians comes into play. And that's why you do, I mean, the Palestinians, it's not a free society, it's not a democratic society, they've never had, there's no political life or political culture. The only political life or political culture that exists in the Palestinian society is factional. You belong to Hamas, or you belong to Fatah, or you belong to Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The elections, like we had elections 20 years ago and never since. So like, this isn't to undo the talk that I'm doing about agency, but I'm just wondering if there's even a comparison.
Ahmed, are you a society of adults? Do you want to be spoken of as a society of adults? There's a continuous era of political and political culture and institutional culture in places like Egypt, Tunisia, that goes back centuries. I do not know in the last 3 years, since October 7th, of a single protest anywhere in the Arab world about October 7th. You could tell me that in Gaza there's a dictatorial regime. You have suffered from it much more than I have, and I believe you. In the West Bank, there's not a democracy, but there certainly isn't a pro-Hamas non-democracy. If somebody had wanted to protest Hamas in the West Bank, I'm quite sure that the authorities would have let it, and it never happened. The pro-Palestinian epistemic community lives here in Oslo, in New York, in London. Somebody is blocking their ability from saying, not in my name, about the holding of hostages. Somebody is blocking their ability from saying 2000 was a good offer. We should be celebrating 26 years of independence because Norway is not a democratic enough state, because it doesn't allow that kind of thing. The conditions that we developed our political culture in weren't rosy either. We lived under a British mandate for less than 30 years. I mean, officially under a mandate for 28 years. We failed at the most important task, which was getting Jews out of Europe in their greatest danger and into the Jewish national home in Palestine. That we didn't succeed to do precisely because of the absence of political military power. But on every other metric in those 28 years, we built institutions that on day one of statehood gave us all the tools for a functioning society. We created a language for immigrant groups that had nothing in common. We managed to build a military that on its first day was able to defeat an invasion from 5 neighboring countries. We had an education system, a health system, all those things, in a mandate that was 28 years. It has now been 32 years since Palestinians had some kind of self-government in the West Bank and Gaza, including 21 years with zero Israeli presence in Gaza, in circumstances that are different. I understand that circumstances are different, although you know what? Not circumstances that were harder. Nothing that the Palestinians went through in the last 32 years compares to what the Jewish people went through during the 28 years of mandate. And we still built the institutions of statehood. Nobody in a German cafe worries that a Jew is going to blow up a bomb there. So, I mean, I would only want to be spoken to as an adult because I see myself as an adult. And I'd be insulted to be spoken to otherwise. And I know that that's how you feel as well. I don't give discounts to people and say, well, they're not developed, they don't have the capacities to make big boy and big girl decisions. I think that is a kind of disrespect.
But let me try to refine the question, because I agree with a lot of your description. I mean, there is no comparison in that term. Israel is a vibrant and pluralistic society, and you're right, but we don't see those demonstrations anywhere in the world. I agree with that premise, to put that out there. But so my question is sort of a little bit milder in a sense. I think those voices are there in the Israeli complex, in the Israeli society, and in the Jewish diaspora as well. The question is maybe whether the majority opinion, the default opinion, is so shaped by perceptions of threat, perceptions of the need to stick together, by the threat of anti-Semitism, by a feeling that the whole world is sort of engaging in this anti-Israeli narrative, that it becomes more difficult, at least, doesn't mean impossible, but it becomes more difficult to sort of, I don't know, like accept any sort of blame to say this was clearly wrong. This is a moral failure. This is a strategic failure. It's more fraught to have that debate now. That's my impression compared to.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. There's always things that are difficult to do in a conflict situation and in a situation of trauma. Otherwise, one thing that I think there's a difference between sort of the public at large and maybe kind of elite opinion, but they both unfortunately push in the same direction. So in the last generation in Israeli domestic politics, there were 3 times that the right wing lost elections very dramatically, in 92 and in 99 and in 2006. And all 3 times the opposition won by big majorities, much bigger than the right has ever won in the other elections that it has won, by basically on a platform of territorial withdrawal and compromise, right? In 92 and in 99 and in 2006. And what happens all 3 times is that the public ends up getting something that's really quite awful. So after 92, we get, for the first time ever, we have a post-Oslo process, we get the first time ever suicide bombings. And after 99, we get the second Intifada. And after 2006, we find ourselves with rocket attacks from the 2 places we've withdrawn from unilaterally. So that, in a sense, that you can complain, and I can complain too, about right-wing preferences of the public at large, but when the public has entrusted the leadership to make more concessions, it's always actually worsened its security situation. That doesn't mean that I think that the argument that I'm making that we do need to leave the territories in one way or another is wrong, but it makes it harder for me to make that argument. That's the public at large. In terms of elite opinion, something else that's in many ways even more destructive happened, which is that it's something that the public maybe cares about a little bit less, but that Israeli elites cared about a lot in the 1990s and even in the age of the unilateral withdrawals of the 2000s, was the idea that if we left these territories and somebody attacked from there, that we would have this full international legitimacy, right? So one of the things that bothered Israeli elites much more than the public at large in the 1980s and the 1990s, after the Lebanon War and after the first Intifada, was how unpopular we had become in the world, that we were the bad guys. That's something that means something to sort of the educated middle classes that have all these international connections that perhaps doesn't mean anything to everybody's grandmother. And that was, for a lot of educated middle class Israeli types, one of the big appeals of these center-left victories was, well, we'll be the good guys again. We'll offer peace, we'll make final status concessions, we'll just withdraw unilaterally, and the world will love us again. And if we're attacked from territories we left, everyone will be on our side. You cannot imagine the long-term damage that happened when that wasn't the case. In the 90s, in the Oslo years, in the second Intifada years, in the years of rocket attacks from areas we left unilaterally, and also in the last 3 years, when so much of righteous global opinion has been mobilized by this obscene lie that Israel's actions after October 7th are in the same category of crime as what the Jewish people experienced in 1940. That's a way of making sure no one will listen to you.
Yeah. And I just want to add like a clarifying comment. And by the way, I very much so agree that like Holocaust inversion is one of the sickest trends that I've seen after October 7th. Notice how I framed what I shared earlier. I said, within the imbalance of power dynamics, my ethos, my approach, I am focused robustly on the gap, the missing element here is Palestinian agency, responsibility, and accountability. That is my focus. But I personally do not dismiss the imbalance of power dynamics. I do not dismiss the fact that Israel very much so is the superior party and element and player here. And I'll operationalize this with two very basic examples, and we don't have to speak about them as analysts or as academics or as smart people. I will dumb it down to you as like literally Gazans that this is a perspective that I hear all the time. A lot of Gazans who are supremely against Hamas are so furious with, and this is where I try to tell them, be angry with Netanyahu and the political trend he represents, but unfortunately to them they say Israel, and this is another thing we need to work on. But they're angry with Israel because they strongly believe that it is precisely Netanyahu's actions, in addition to Hamas's terrorism, the support from the Qataris, the entrenchment and empowerment from UNRWA and the international NGOs, but they specifically point, when I bring up agency, when I bring up guys like the Future, they specifically point, and they're like, F Netanyahu, without him, Hamas would not have been as strong, as capable. Hamas would have inevitably, without the arrangement, the unholy thing through the Qatari suitcases, 30 to 35 million, verbatim, I'm repeating this. Hamas would have faced financial crises that would have caused a reckoning, even if it meant a war earlier, even if it meant the collapse of its governance, even if it meant chaos in Gaza, it wouldn't have been as bad as letting Hamas get entrenched to launch something as catastrophic as October 7th. So that is one view right now, that if we, when we're following up offline after this, I can literally just Google a few, or I can send you, I have your WhatsApp, I will send you screenshots of that. So like, that is one area where those who are moderate, and I hate that term moderate, but I have to accept it for the time being. Those who are moderate in the Palestinian discourse swim against and struggle against. And then more broadly, there's a perception that basically the Palestinian president, Abbas, despite the 2008, and I mean, the explanation that we hear from the pro-Palestinian Authority people is that Abbas didn't feel that he could credibly negotiate because he didn't have Gaza, blah, blah, blah. I don't buy it, but fine. That he practically got on his knees and like begged and said, like, please just like give us any peace. I'm gonna disarm, we've already disarmed, I'm gonna go after the terrorists, like I'm gonna do security coordination, I'm gonna do whatever you want, Israel, but please stop delegitimizing me and humiliating me with the spreading of settlements, with the like undermining me and entrenching my chief arch rival in Gaza. And so that's another thing that the anti-Hamas, otherwise moderate Palestinians point to, as Israel made those choices. Israel made those decisions through the entrenchment of the settlement enterprise in the West Bank, through the 3D chess maneuvering of Hamas and Qatar in Gaza. Those are Israeli decisions that, regardless of, they think, what degree of agency as individual Palestinian citizens they exercise, their agency was going to be overpowered by the more superior party, aka Israel.
I think it's interesting to listen to a little bit of engagement there, because to me it shows that there's a will, there's a supreme will, common will to introspection. Quite that I think is fascinating. But also sort of there's this dynamic where each party sort of needs to defend something, right? I mean, that's the psychology that I was referring to. And I think a difference here, it's not only the power dynamics, but it's the dignity dynamics. And we see this now across the world. We see it in the West, with people feeling that their dignity is challenged. We see it in Russia, that I know well, I lived there for a while, a country that lacks dignity and responds in very destructive ways. And one thing that the Israeli state project gave, I think very clearly, was dignity. And it's one thing that Palestinian project has lacked because of the conditions it's served. So it's not that it's materially worse than any other, incumbent or aspiring state, but it's happening in a very specific dignity environment. But I want to change the theme a little bit to move into some other geopolitical actors in the region. There is, in addition to Israel, there's one actor that is a scribe agency in Norway, and that is the US. So let's bring in the US for a little bit. And I want to get your view on what the US, with Trump, with Kushner, with all these people, what are they trying to achieve now with Iran, with the region, with the Abraham Accords, with the Sunni states, and with Gaza? Because that's something I don't have any good answers. I just want to say briefly to the audience that we're not really discussing everything about the war. There's been a lot of discussion about the war over the last many years, and this is a discussion about something else. So I'm not going to challenge anything you say about the actual conduct of the war, but let's move on to the US role. What's your view on the US goal? They're in a war now. How does it align with their strategy in the region? What they're trying to achieve? Will they achieve?
Well, you're very ambitious. You talk about a strategy for the region. I don't think there is.
I'll give you 3-4 minutes.
Well, no, I can answer that question in 3-4 minutes because I don't think there is a strategy for the region. I don't even think there is a strategy for the Iran war. And I think that is tells you quite a bit about if I was sitting in Israel or I was sitting in Gaza. Right now, it's probably not the time to look for original ideas to emanate from Washington, D.C. I'm not exaggerating when I say pretty much the experts that are out of job right now, that might function in their roles, but they're not being heard right now. U.S. foreign policy, from what I can tell, is being shaped by small groups of people, mostly obviously around President Trump, and for good or bad. And there is no long-term vision in terms of an Arab-Israeli peace. This is not something that I see. You guys might disagree with me on this. Maybe this is too elaborate and I'm missing it. Maybe it's happening quietly, but I look at the United States right now and the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I'm enjoying listening to my two panelists discuss it, so I don't want to get too much into that. But what I see in the United States as someone who's in the think tank world is what a tremendous shift in attitude in terms of the U.S. role in the Middle East, and just being fed up and tired. And on the Iran war, for example, this is the first war probably in history where the United States went into a war with very low approval rating for the president taking the country to war. And that gives you a taste of where the country is. The United States is not in a country that's going to commit itself open-ended, being a police officer or mediator between the Arab and Israelis forever and ever. I think that generation is gone. We have about $40 trillion of debt that we have to pay. We have a lot of issues in the United States that needs to be fixed. So, whether it's the Arab-Israeli issue or any other foreign policy issue, President Trump basically said it himself, although he hasn't lived up to it, burden sharing and let countries out there who have issues deal with their issues themselves. And that to me is, in many ways, is a defensible position, but it doesn't mean obviously that he has a strategy to back that up. The strategy has to come from countries that are in conflict. I think U.S. public opinion really is in a place right now where foreign policy has become genuinely just a burden. And whether, they might have sympathies in the past with the Israelis and the Palestinians, I feel we're getting to the point where people really do want to look inwards. And that is what President Trump was essentially elected on. And I think that in many ways in the future, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, you can call them isolationists, you can call them names, But the reality is, and I'm sure that people here in Norway who pay good high percentage of taxes want to see some services as a result of those taxes. And that's essentially not happening in the United States. It's not just about foreign policy. It's certainly not just limited to the issue of Israel-Palestine. There's a structural issue here that to me suggests that if I'm Israel, if I'm Palestine, I'm looking down the road and saying, I've been in this conflict for almost 80 years now, and I can't bank on the Americans anymore. Because right now, the United States is obsessed with one issue, and it's going to be an obsession that's going to get bigger and bigger, and that's called China. And it's not in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's not even Iran, it's China. It's in the Pacific. It's going to cost a lot of money. We are behind on the Chinese on every level, on every metric. Whether it's military, technologically, AI, we are behind. We cannot be affording to be distracted on some of these sort of very important files that need to be resolved. But I think the idea that you sort of wait for those original ideas to come from Washington, I think you're going to be waiting a long time.
Okay, this is not something I do often, but let me give you the talking points for the Trump agenda.
Please do.
This is not my actual analysis, but let's just give it anyway. You'd say, okay, they came in the first administration with the Abraham Accords, aiming for a Sunni realignment to keep the Iranians out, and hopefully foster a better relationship between their allies in the region, Israel and Saudi Arabia. That will also keep China out. They're now pursuing the war in Iran. They hope to change the leadership, but okay, that didn't work. But they're hoping to keep the proxy war down and keep the Chinese out, and that would be sort of the goal of that. And in order for this strategy really to work, they would at some point need to engage with the conflict in order to facilitate that alliance, or that at least approximation between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But you don't think they're not really, that's not really a strategy, it's more coincidence.
Well, Abraham Accords was something that was being planned for some 20 years. It wasn't Donald Trump's idea. It just happened when he was in his first term. The Israelis, the Emiratis have had relations going back a long time. But no, I don't see the dots being connected the way you just described it. I mean, that would have been great if that was the case. But the Abraham Accords right now is essentially in a very dangerous situation in terms of countries that are thinking, what did we actually get out of? And I'm someone who believes exactly the sort of Abraham Accords would be good for the region, because I believe in Israel's right to exist as a nation state that should be left alone. But I also believe there should be a Palestinian state at some point, and I think that's the majority view in the Middle East, if not the world. Now, obviously, as you just heard, it's not going to be easy. And as someone like myself who's traveled to Israel 4 or 5 times, just looking at the boundaries where a future Palestinian state would be, yes, it's going to be very hard. And I say that as a non-expert. It's going to be very hard, but that doesn't mean you don't try. And I understand that Israelis are very upset about what happened on October 7th, and the majority of Israelis, from what I understand, are not supportive of a two-state solution right now. But looking ahead 10, 15, 20 years' time, can you sustain that position forever? Because those 7, 8 million Palestinians are not going to all move to Greenland, whether somebody wants to opt that or not, right? So what are you going to do?
But another dot in the Trump plan. Okay, Shany, let's move to you. How do you view the U.S. role? Because you've seen the polls, and the U.S. polls or the U.S. view attitudes towards Israel are changing, most notably in the Democratic Party, but also in the Republican Party. And after 2009, we don't really know exactly what the will be. How important is that for Israel? How do you view the U.S. role, the U.S. freedom of action in the region? How much can they actually achieve?
Well, I want to take you back to the last time that the U.S. did have a coherent strategy in place, which was actually very long ago. It was really 2022, 2023. And the Biden administration was working on a strategy for the region that was brilliant. I mean, I get very sad when I look back and think how close it came to success. They really, for the first time in a very long time, you had an administration that didn't look at the Middle East as some kind of philosophical, moral, domestic play acting thing, and rather saw all of the American interests, saw the various levers that they had, and saw the overriding concern which they had was China. And so they had a brilliant plan to keep China out of the Gulf by offering the Saudis a long-term agreement but enticing the Saudis by leveraging what the Saudis needed in order to keep the Chinese out, to bring them to do something that should have been a priority for American foreign policy for decades, but for some reason wasn't, which was regional Arab-Israeli peace. And so they managed to do something that looked at exactly what the picture was in terms of naval power, superpower alliances, regional disputes, energy, and lined everything up to something that really worked for American interests. I don't think there had been anybody in Washington until the early Biden administration that had such a mature and coherent strategy for the region. And it all fell apart before it even got to begin because of October 7th. I think part of the blindness to October 7th was because for the first time there really was such a brilliant strategy. And so countervailing factors were ignored. Since that grand strategy fell apart, nobody in Washington has tried to create an alternative, not in the Biden years and not in the Trump years. Nobody even wants to bother with it. Everything that there's been since has been a series of improvisations and occasionally some fantastical plans and a lot of domestic politics. Maybe that's the way of the world. Maybe that's the best you can do, because the brilliant strategy didn't actually come to fruition. At the time, I was very enthusiastic about it, I have to say. I'm not saying this as a critique of the Biden administration. I actually thought in that brief period that there were adults in the room for the first time. And I was hugely disappointed by the result as well, to say nothing of shocked and surprised as everybody else was. So that's where we are. We're in a place of improvisation. We're also in a place, as you said, of retrenchment. From Israel's perspective, days of one superpower being the only one that matters, which is how Israeli national security policy was done from the mid-1970s until very recently. I think those days were gone.
Can I just add one quick thing on the Abraham Accords, and I'll love your thoughts on it. So everybody that joined the Abraham Accords did it for their own reasons, but mostly they did so because they thought it would get them good brownie points in Washington, D.C. Morocco did it for its reasons, Bahrain did, so on. UAE, slightly different case, Kazakhstan later for its own sake. Wouldn't the ideal world be in a place where countries in the region join Abraham Accords, regardless of where the United States stands on the issue of Israel? Wouldn't that be Israel's challenge? That it is attractive to neighboring states, like it is to UAE. UAE genuinely is attractive to Israel for its technological advancements and the things that it can actually bring to the table, regardless of the fact that Israel and US have close relations, which is the reason why other countries have joined Abraham Accords. You see what I'm going with?
It would be, in an ideal world, there would be normal diplomatic relations between Israel and the Arab countries in 1949. The big elephant in the room always when we discuss this conflict is the Arab rejection of Israel. We treat normalization, even though the word kind of indicates what it is, as a special reward rather than as what is normal. Well, there should be an embassy. There should be an embassy from every Arab state.
Sure, but what's in the way today?
But UAE is an interesting case because normalization gave it a competitive advantage over Saudi Arabia, and that's particularly true as the petroleum aspect of all those countries' economies declines. When you can openly conduct financial and business transactions and direct flights with this small regional technological power, you have an advantage over this much larger state that would otherwise be able to do this. So that's very important for UAE. That's something that normalization provides that discrete defense relationships could never do.
Right.
Yeah, and that's a very important factor. The other countries that you said, each one of them is its own separate story. Neither the United States nor the international community at large has ever pushed for any of this in 8 decades is a big question mark. I don't know why. I mean, I do know why, but it has a lot to do with some of the other issues that we talked about earlier. That should be not just the goal, but the insistence of the international community. Normal countries, even if they disagree on major policy issues, recognize each other, use each other's name when talking about each other, send each other's sports teams to competitions, trade with each other. Don't pretend that the other one doesn't exist. That is good. It's not a reward for settling the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. It'll actually be one of the things that makes settling it much, much easier. That to me would be an obvious policy goal. It's not, for some reason, not in Washington, not in Paris or London, but elsewhere. That I think is a tragic mistake. That's very, very difficult to undo. In terms of a grand strategy for the United States, there isn't one today. I think in Jerusalem there's a keen understanding that that's the case, and the preparation for that.
Is the Israeli public and the Israeli state ready for possible, say, anti-Israel US president after 29? Or just the absence?
I'm sure it's a scenario that's being considered. That has implications in terms of defense autarky. It has implications in terms of weapons production and things like that. That's already baked in. Right. That's baked in. That there's no situation where Israel can run low on munitions because of some disagreement with Washington.
Will it make it more or less likely, or will it make Israel more or less likely to pursue peace as a prioritized strategy? Again,
Israel is a very small actor in this, right? The absence of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement is not because there are many things that Israel has done that has made it more difficult or worse. But at the end of the day, at every moment where it has been possible for Israel to reconcile with the Palestinian national movement, there's been domestic opposition in Israel, but it's always been steamrolled. The reason that there isn't an Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation today is the same reason that there wasn't one in 2014, and it's the same reason there wasn't one in 2008 or in 2000 or in 47 or at any points between. There has not been on the other side an acceptance that we are there, that 48 is irreversible, and that there are two national movements here.
But the question is slightly different, because if you say the Oslo Accords or the Table negotiation or 2008, those are processes where the US has been very involved, right? You could say they've been pushing the process. So if you look back to Oslo, it sort of started with Madrid meeting in 91, and the US basically tells Israel, we'd like you to do this, they do it. And in the absence of the US, in order for the conditions for a peace process to be there, it would need a more active Israeli policy choice, not to accept or reject, but to put in the groundwork to facilitate it. And you could argue both ways. You could say, without the US, we are more vulnerable, and that means we should, make regional alliances, find a way for some sort of political process, get into the neighborhood on peaceful terms. Or you could say, without the US, security is much more important, and we cannot allow the risk of, another Gaza, another conflict situation. And you put that in the West Bank. We can't do that. You could argue both ways. Do you have a feeling where the Israeli Republic is?
I think there's always a preference. There's a natural preference for a greater U.S. involvement. I think the U.S. role there's nothing to replace it in terms of superpower involvement in the region. But from the Israeli perspective, there's an ability to deal with all those things, right? Before we had a tight alliance with the United States, wars that broke out were brought to a militarily decisive conclusion. Since the 1970s, when Israel has been so dependent on American military aid, that hasn't been the case. On balance, I think it's been very good for Israel, but there are advantages and disadvantages. It's a very different kind of region to deal with or without the U.S. There's no other global power that can possibly replace it there. But the U.S. almost, I would say, in a almost monotonically, without any blips, from 2003 to the present, has been on a trend of retrenchment from the region.
Yeah.
So yeah, on the one, the only thing that I would add is maybe just some of we've seen the necessity for large transfers of U.S. munitions over the last 3 years, and I fail to imagine where else those would go, would come from. I share your assessment that in the near term, Israel will be resilient from a defense point of view, whereby the reliance on the United States will subside. But just assessing, like in raw tonnage, the amount of munitions and the D9 bulldozers that Biden withheld and then Trump allowed, there's very much so still core dependencies that cannot simply be replaced. That said, one of the things, going back to the broader pro-Palestine movement, and I notice I put it in quotes, or let's more broadly call it the pro-Palestine industrial complex. They've reduced shifts in U.S. policy, basically to cutting off of the $3.8 billion annual aid, military aid to Israel. And I think that is incredibly short-sighted to think that somehow that will fundamentally A, alter Israel's behavior, B, make Israel militarily weaker, C, somehow cause the United States to radically shift how it views Israel. The United States gets an immense amount out of its relationship with Israel, not just in terms of, the defense industry of Israel is heavily integrated in the United States. They set up a lot of subsidiaries in the US. They're on the New York Stock Exchange and other stock markets. And so the Pentagon has a lot of working relationships that are very fruitful from an American defense point of view. So this is where I look at the translation of the global groundswell of support for the Palestinian people, the millions of people marching around the world, the social media activists, everybody, don't stop thinking about Palestine and talking about Palestine, whatever. Like, talk to me about how that has translated into policy gains. And I'm sorry, but Norway recognizing Palestine as a state is not a policy gain. Like, I respect Norway immensely, except when the Gestapo shows up yesterday and tries to do some random bullshit with me. But other than your guys' Gestapo, that I hope you demand accountability for, I love and respect Norway very immensely. But your recognition of a Palestinian state, I'm not going to sit here, and neither are the Palestinian people or the Palestinian National Project, and say this is a policy success. The United States recognizing the Palestinian state, even with the realities lacking on the ground or not having, that could potentially be something significant. So, but let's not forget. There's just so much happening in the world that we forget. One of the first things that President Trump said and did when he started this tenure, do you guys remember when he said, the United States is going to take over Gaza and we're going to do something with it? And do you remember that AI video of the Hamas transgender belly dancers and Elon Musk eating hummus on the Gaza beach? Remember the Trump gold hotels in Gaza? Like, that was US policy on like week one, was like transgender dancers like on Gaza beaches, like former Hamas fighters becoming like dancers. And Gaza basically becoming like a golden strip club for President Trump. So and the U.S. taking over Gaza. Those were the words. We will take over Gaza and we will do a job with it. Now we can laugh at it, and yes, it's worthy of laughter or whatever. But like in the Middle East, and where a lot of the presidents there are just hanging on by a thread, and Al Jazeera is pumping out all the propaganda. Like, this was like just an earth-shattering shift in U.S. policy, and this like just the golden strip club in Gaza is just not how the Middle East, is not how President Sisi, it's not how Jordan's king thought about it. So that's on one end. Then on the other end, I have immense gratitude for the fact that ultimately, so we just went from over here to, I think only somebody like President Trump and the very unconventional actions could have gotten us the type of a ceasefire deal in October 2025 that returned all the still living hostages. Of course, Hamas murdered a bunch of hostages in its captivity and the body. But that, one of the things that I did throughout the wars, I tried to build partnerships and allyship with hostage families and survivors of October 7th, and that was part of my ethos, is to try to overcome some of the pain and the suffering and the hardships and push for healing and reconciliation, not as kumbaya, but actually as like a framework that can lead to viable pathways forward and ultimately policy. So President Trump delivered that. Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff delivered that. So there's something to be said that I have also grown to really appreciate over time about the so-called, it's a cliche, thinking outside of the box. The problem is sometimes the Trump administration forgets where the box is. So you still have to, you think outside of it, but you have to be in close proximity to the box so that you ultimately come back to it and you figure out what you're going to do with it. So that's on one end. And then finally, right now, what my assessment is of US foreign policy towards the Middle East in general, and specifically towards Israel and Palestine, is great ideas in theory, very poor execution and follow through. I loved it and could potentially go back to loving the Board of Peace concept. I actually found that very compelling, very, very compelling, to ground the transformation of Gaza, the transitional period, not just not just in let's bring in the UN agencies to do the same old reconstruction mechanisms, and let's bring in the PA and everything is so boring and we're gonna go back to the old ways. It's no, let's shake up the status quo and actually maybe we end up with something that could resemble a new cadre of Palestinian professionals rising, moderates, doctors, engineers, professors, journalists, actual journalists, not the Hamas journalists, not that everybody says, oh my God, Israel killed a journalist, and the guy's like a Hamas commander, give me a break. So but that class of that professional class of Palestinians in Gaza, that when people are like, Ahmed, where are the moderate Palestinians? Where are the future leaders of the Palestinians? It's like, dude, I can't tell you their name, but they exist in the tens of thousands. People that they don't want permanent jihad with Israel. They don't want to dismantle the Zionist entity. These are folks that are not part of Hamas. They're not part of Fatah. They could give birth to a new political culture. There's no political culture in Palestinian society and life. There's no political life in the West Bank. There's palace politics around President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. That's not real. So the Board of Peace, great in theory, but then the launch and the way of you pay into it, and President Trump wrote himself as the permanent head of it, and you invite Belarus and contribute $1 billion. Belarus, who needs Belarus on the Board of Peace, for goodness sake? So once we started going beyond, this is what I said, you gotta remember where the box is. Don't go over there, brother, the box is right here. So I think, unfortunately, if we can show the administration where the box is, the Board of Peace still has some hope. And we're stuck with this for the next 2 years, so God help us.
Thank you. We're soon running out of time, so there will be no time for questions from the audience.
No!
These guys have too many interesting things to say.
What does the audience think about that?
You can read all about Ahmed's story with the Gestapo, of course, and accountability has been demanded by my newspaper, Minerva, so please go read that story. Which reminds me that I think I forgot to introduce myself when I came. But, yeah. My name is Nils. I'm the editor of Minerva. Yeah, some of you knew. Just briefly about the transgender strip club in Gaza, since you mentioned it. There is a saying in chess, a terrible plan is better than no plan. So it is a plan, so it has that going for it. I just want to say, this is going to be the last question for all of you. We have not been discussing genocide or that whole debate today. We've not been discussing anti-Semitism. But that's a deliberate choice. We don't have to say that because the Norwegian debate about Israel and Palestine is a debate about those things. And I wanted us to speak about something different. I wanted to speak about the dynamics of conflict and the agency of the different constituent parties of that conflict in its regional and geopolitical context. I think we've done that. I want to challenge you as we're going for a close, to challenge us, but also maybe, it's stupid to offer us hope because that's not really the way things work in the Middle East. But what can we do better in Norway in our debate about this conflict? In Norway, of course, the general take on this conflict has been how can we solve it? We're not going to solve it. So I think we, even though you insulted us bravely by saying that the US recognition means more than Norwegian, I think a lot of people in the audience recognize that Norway is not going to solve this conflict. It still matters how we talk about it. It matters because everyone who engages in the region should do more than pointing fingers. It should understand the actors. And one of the things you said about Trump is that he sort of brushed aside the moral way of engaging with conflict and saying, these are the actors, these are their interests, here they could have some common ground, this is what can be done. Probably more constructive than a lot of the other things that have been tried. But it's important for us to have a better conversation about it because the debate about Israel and Palestine is polarizing and destructive also within the Norwegian context and within a lot of European contexts. It fosters anti-Semitism, also fosters anti-Muslim sentiment. It's just not a good conversation because what we do is, and that's why I brought up these questions about when so much is at stake, it's difficult to recognize anything. And this is evident in the Norwegian context where nothing is at stake, really. Like, nothing is at stake for people in Norway, but latch on to these very emotional debates. So we try to get out of this now. What can you offer us of departing perspectives and advice? We'll start with you, Alex.
Sure. I mean, I'll go back to something you asked me about Iran's role in this, but let me just zoom out, not just Iran, but the issue of the axis of resistance and to your question about what Norway can do, what the rest of the world can do. I would suggest, and I don't know if the issue of Iran's support for, say, Hamas or Hezbollah or any other of the members of the axis of resistance is top of the agenda when Norwegian diplomats in Tehran are talking to Iranians or anybody else from Europe is talking to the Iranians. But I thought it would be a very good idea if they did.
We are talking to them.
And talk more, because you have to increase the pressure. Because frankly, it's not helping the situation for the Palestinians. I've rarely ever met Palestinians who actually enjoy or said, yeah, we love what Iran is doing for us. In fact, I often hear the opposite. Iran is using us for its own purposes, to advance its own regional agenda. And they're doing so at the expense of the Iranian national interest. So I would say, if I was the European Union, if I was sitting in Brussels or somewhere else, and I'm looking for some kind of a critical dialogue with the Islamic Republic, sure, right now we all know the focus on the Strait of Hormuz and the price of oil, and maybe next is going to be the nuclear issue. But if you really want to sort of weaken this idea of violence as a way forward in solving this conflict, then you've got to identify the key actors. Islamic Republic is one of them. Increase the pressure, the cost, and hope that they will change their mind. I have a feeling they might change their mind. I just don't think there'll be enough pressure to think about some of their policy choices when it comes to supporting groups like Hamas, which instead, end of the day, hasn't really delivered results for the Palestinians or for the people of Iran. So that's how I would probably phrase it. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's one way of and obviously, I just mentioned Iran because my focus, my day job is Iran. There are other countries, and by the way, I should add, don't for a second assume if Iran stops supporting Hamas, that that's the end of Hamas. There will be other players out there that'll fill that gap if it fits their interest. I understand that a lot of Hamas folks have already moved from Doha to Turkey. So watch that space. This is not just about Iran. This is about the idea that as long as you have this conflict, there will be countries in the region that will look to use it to mobilize popular support. And whether we like it or not, the Palestine cause, you defined it much better than I could, does have a lot of support on the street level, and it matters. So make sure you don't hand that over to the radicals out there, give it to the more sensible policymakers in the countries that you're dealing with. Let me stop there.
Thank you. I think it's an interesting thing that in Norway, but in most European countries, a lot of the question is how do we pressure Israel? Boycott, sanctions, blah, blah, blah. Of course, we don't have the same ability to pressure, we can pressure anyone, but we can't pressure Iran because we don't have too many dealings with them. We do have political talks that have been criticized by some pro-Israel voices. We do have political talks with Iran. Another question is, can we actually pressure them? I don't know. But that goes also to, of course, the Palestinian polity, if you will, where Norway has some leverage, and there's a question, how do we use it? Because I often think we conflate, or pressure is supposed to be applied to the actors that we sort of blame morally for what's going on. But regardless of you blame morally, that's not really how we should look at pressure. It's like with what kind of pressure is it possible to achieve what kind of result? That's what we're looking for. So thank you for that. I'm going to take you now, Shany. What's your suggestions for a Norwegian debate, and also maybe where do you see any way forward?
We've spoken about the conflict. We've spoken about the geopolitical situation. These are really important. That entire problem, I think, is orthogonal to the discussion. I don't think that the discussion has to do with the conflict. I don't think that the conflict perception is somehow biased. I think that what you are experiencing, what's causing this discomfort, is that this is a theological obsession with Israeli sin. The reason why there might be more emphasis, you're suggesting there's more of an emphasis on blaming Israel than there is on blaming the Palestinian or the Arab side. And I don't think that that's really the correct diagnosis. Of course, there's going to be more of an emphasis on blaming Israel because the entire discussion isn't a geopolitical discussion. It is a discussion of Jewish sin. That is not just out of proportion to the situation, but unrelated to the situation. It's not only not helping, it's actively harming. And one even begins to wonder what the goals of that whole moral edifice actually are. Mediation in conflict, in any conflict, not just between warring states, in a divorcing couple, between labor and management, in any situation of conflict, when you mediate between two conflicting sides, your goal is to bring both sides to an outcome that is better for both sides than what you could realistically hope to gain in open confrontation, right? So when you come to labor and management, you say, here is a deal where you guys both get something better than what you get if you go to a strike. When you come to a divorcing couple, you say, here's a way of splitting the property and the child custody that is better for both of you than what you can realistically hope to get by taking this to trial. Same thing with a plea bargain, and same thing with states that we have 500 years at least of accumulated knowledge of diplomacy and war and peace processes. We throw all of that accumulated knowledge out the window when it comes to the conflicts that involve the Jewish state. We do everything since 1949 we, meaning the international community and all these do-gooder organizations, whatever, that is the opposite of what we do in every other conflict situation. We invest internationally, morally, financially, not in solving the conflict or mediating the conflict, but in entrenching the conflict. There's no more obscene example than UNRWA, right? By the way, Norway recognizes that there's a Palestinian state, but then funds the organization of refugees living in that state who are refugees from that state. It makes no sense. How can you be a refugee when you are a Palestinian born in Palestine, where are you a refugee from? What does, that is not an investment, a humanitarian investment. That's not an investment in mediation. That is an investment in entrenching the conflict. That's an investment in making sure there will still be a conflict in another generation. And I think people feel really good about that. I suspect that people feel really good about hating Israel. I think it's a lot of fun. It's not fun for me. I think it is massively cathartic. It has, I have been traveling in and out of Europe now for decades, and I've even lived about 8 years in different European countries. Well, I guess about 9 years in total in different European countries, including in Scandinavia, various parts of my adult life. There has never been a time since the 1990s when I didn't go into a modern art museum or a gallery where there wasn't an exhibit, often of very little artistic merit, that was something about Israeli sin. There has never been a time when I went to a cultural event or something at any point from the 1990s onward where there wasn't something about, they won't say it's about Israel, it's about Palestine. But they don't actually seem to care very much about the actual place or the people who are there. Ask somebody who's devoted to the cause of Palestine to name 3 things that they like about Palestinians that aren't just general to the Arab world and have nothing to do with Israel and the conflict. They will come up with 0. They enjoy this hatred. They enjoy this moral pose. And I think the reasons for it are pretty transparent, but you don't need my analysis for it. So if I understand, by the way, because I'm not a believer, I'm a secular person as well, I understand that the pull in 2026 of going to church and its other rituals may feel not so convincing in a time of science and doubt and rationalism and whatever. But my goodness, at least Church Classic produced great music and beautiful stained glass windows. This ritual of Jew hatred, this ritual of an assumed brotherhood of people that is only blocked by one recalcitrant people who received the Annunciation in 1945 of international law and brotherhood, but they alone, because of their stubbornness, resisted, and we have to campaign against them. What the hell is it producing? You know, I mean, sometimes I wish that people could just go back to church on Sundays and leave us alone. I don't think that this cause has contributed anything to the peoples of the Middle East, and I'm not sure that it's contributing very much domestically.
Let me give you a soft pushback to defend Norwegian honor.
I'm not attacking Norway.
A little bit. Because I think it's, I think some of what you're saying is true. I agree with a lot of it. I don't think the Palestinian cause in Norway and in Europe has produced any results. The example you give with the Palestinian state and refugees is good, and Minerva has produced those results of making this conflict permanent in so many ways. But Norway, the discussion about this topic in Norway was different during the 90s, for obvious reasons, because of the Oslo process, and also before that, it was different. So it's not only like, I'm not denying that anti-Semitism is part of both the history and the contemporary status of that debate, but explaining the shifts in the narrative, the weight of different elements, how opinion moves from one side to another, requires something more than just one narrative that, like, this constant Jew hatred has always been exactly the same and is always sort of the explanation for whatever shape debate on Israel is taking. It's not a satisfactory, it's not enough to explain it. It's there for sure, and that's one of the reasons we're having this one. But must be something else that explains it. So, and I have a lot of candidates. We're not going to go into all those. But one thing I think is important, and I agree with you that anti-Semitism is part of this, but just the fact that Israel is the only part with agency. But it's not unique to Israel. It's the same whenever the West is involved, in a sense. It's like if there is a US conflict involving the US, it's only the US that has agency. Because that's the party we know, that's the language we understand, that's the people we feel are like us, so we feel that we can criticize them. whereas the others we treat as children, as you said, in a sense. So that's a few thought, a soft perspective to defend Norway's honor.
Can I ask you though?
Yeah.
The Iraq War, was it popular here?
No.
It was not popular. But was your artistic and cultural scene all about moral stripteases of Americans, how American culture
No,
is somehow...
but I'm not denying.
Your museums weren't filled with how Americans are somehow contaminated. You didn't have people asking to boycott
Vietnam
America.
War.
You
Vietnam
didn't
War.
have, but did you have that? Did you have the religious fervor about
Vietnam
Americans
War,
as
yeah.
Americans?
Yeah, I mean, during the Vietnam War, I'd say it was quite strong. But I mean, I'm not saying none of these incidents are caused by what you're saying. I'm just saying the whole public debate is much more than radicals in the museums, in a sense.
Yeah, I understand that. And I understand that there's many factors here, and I'm not saying that Israel is blameless in anything, but there is a fervor and a passion on this one issue that is discombobulating.
It's very strong. I can disagree. I agree. But let's move to you, Ahmed, and you're getting the final word. We're a little bit on overtime, but everyone is forgiving us. Your recommendations, and if you see any glimmer of hope or anything in the future.
I'm pleading with the Norwegian government to please stop funding dumb shit. So please, I'm begging you very politely and kindly. I'm really hoping that some of the funding, I'm not asking for more funding, but maybe just a small chunk of it could be redirected for a social or peace entrepreneurs for Palestinians who actually want to create a new and a different reality, for the divergent points of views that are going to create a different future, perpetually funding the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA, which I met with senior government officials and they swore up and down why this is God's gift to the universe and they will never cut funding to UNRWA and completely cut funding to UNRWA and the Palestinian Authority. Okay, fine. But can we please just redirect some of that funding? Domestically, I'm not Norwegian, I'm an outside observer, but I have learned about some of the really, I think, harmful domestic initiatives that are being funded in the name of cultural enrichment, in the name of countering racism, in the name of positive things that I think many societies need, but have been hijacked and taken over by destructive voices and elements, and yet again turned into part of the pro-Palestine industrial complex. So domestically and internationally, I think there's a lot of potential for funding new voices, new initiatives, something that really does something fundamentally different for the Norwegian people and for the Palestinian people, other than UNRWA and the Palestinian Authority. So that's one. Two, please stop talking about we need to have elections in the Palestinian territories right away. Norway's apparently on this thing right now where it's part of a group of European countries that are pushing for elections to be held as soon as possible in the Palestinian territories. It seems as if they haven't learned from 20 years ago that A, there is no Palestinian political culture that exists right now, and B, that you can't, just like you can't, the timing of the recognition of the Palestinian state, I think was misplaced, because doing it during a war where Hamas, an internationally recognized terrorist group, controls half of the desired Palestinian state. And so like timing is everything. Of course I want there to ultimately be election, but I'm sorry to disturb you and to disrupt your bubble here. Democracy is not the answer to Gaza right now. Right now, the answer is disarmament, it's de-radicalization, it's reconstruction, and it is the gradual establishment of a social and political life that can support and uplift elections. Elections and democracy is not just people going to the booth and voting. It is about free press. It is about the free assembly. It is about people being able to, my friends in Gaza, my actual friends, I send them money to survive. They write comments on Facebook, and Hamas abducts them and tortures them in hospitals that Norway, by the way, funds. Thank you very much. And then, oh my God, oh, we can't speak about hospitals being tortured because Ahmed, you're such a Zionist because you're normalizing Israel targeting hospitals. No, I'm not talking about Israel targeting hospitals. I'm saying that there are Hamas is not funding its own hospitals in Gaza, okay? But the medical system in Gaza that is funded entirely by the UN, by the Europeans, by the Norwegians, by the Belgians, has absolutely been weaponized by Hamas to turn it into torture dungeons, into the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of the Economy, which oversaw the largest organized theft of aid, probably in the modern history. The amount of tonnage that went into Gaza per capita is greater than in Sudan, it's greater than in Yemen, it's great throughout the last 3 years. And yet the distribution of that aid was very inequitable and very uneven. And I would meet with Norwegian NGO folks and officials and Norway Refugee Council and many others, and I'll be like, and your beloved media, yes. And I was like, oh, let me share with you examples of how I think, and I was very polite and moderate and very, very modest. And it was like, oh, no, but you can't deny that Israel is stopping the delivery of blah, 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 blah. It's like, yes, okay, there are issues on the Israeli side, blah, blah, but I want to focus specifically. I'm not talking about Israel here. I'm talking about once aid makes it into Gaza. So I guess the third thing to tie it, to just put a name to what I'm saying, is Norway needs to actually have an open mind and like a humble approach to the Israel and Palestine conflict. Like when I met the last meeting, and I'll stop here. I know we're so over time, but like the last official I met with was like, oh, we're just a Scandinavian country, and we're so humble, and we need to listen and understand. But then they proceeded to giving me a lecture for 45 minutes about why Norway is doing the right thing, and Norway is the most pro-Palestine country in Europe. And every time I try to speak, I was like, no, but let me tell you why. So I think there's a missing humility in the Norwegian social. I plead with people. I know most of Norway, a lot of people in Norway are empathetic and sympathetic to the Palestinian people. That's lovely, that's wonderful. But just remember, there's more to being pro-Palestine than simply being anti-Israel.
Thank you so much, all three of you. And your last advice, it's very good advice to listen more. And I know we don't always do that. I usually don't listen at all. And people who have seen me in other occasions will know, even if I did give a little bit of pushback sometimes, I will listen much more today than I usually do. And I've learned a lot. And I've enjoyed listening to all three of you. And to sum up, maybe one last thing that we could all agree on. The Norwegian pro-Palestine cause should talk way more about Palestinians and way less about Israel. And that would be better for everyone. Thank you so much.
You did a good job. You landed in the Middle East and you just like drove through it. Like I wish the rest of us could do. I made myself some notes today because, as you saw, this night was supposed to be called "The Future of the Middle East." Did you hear anything futuristic? Actually, it was rather a sobering journey through the past and the present, and a reaffirming shower, I would say, of just how much mess we're actually in the Middle East. Instead, we got really, like, there was nothing futuristic, optimistic about what went down there tonight, and yet, strangely, I think there was some hope in this conversation. Maybe this is where hope actually begins. Perhaps Hope begins with being able to look soberly at reality, at the lived experiences of the people who actually live in the region, at all the different pieces, devastation, fear, trauma, political failures, loss that have accumulated over generations. And at the fact that there is no single experience, of this conflict, and this is what happened here tonight. Maybe the glimpse of the future we were eager to hear about was actually the conversation itself, right? We heard a conversation about Israel, Palestine, and the wider Middle East, where voices that rarely get much space in Norway were actually given a room to speak, right? A conversation that did not begin with Israel, the ultimate evil, with the language about uniquely genocide, an equally genocidal Jewish state, etc., etc. That kind of language may feel morally clear and simple to deal with, but it often does something very simple. It reduces an extraordinarily complicated reality into something much easier to understand. And we need to be very careful about that. All of us have a responsibility. And when we simplify reality too much, we also make solutions harder to be imagined. Complexity does not mean abandoning moral standards. None of this means that Israel should somehow be protected from criticism. Israel should be held to serious standards for its conduct in the war and for the decisions of its government. Violent settlers that we've seen a lot of in the last days deserve our strongest condemnation. Palestinians deserve security, dignity, political rights, and a future. And Israel deserves security, dignity, and a future too. These things are not contradictory. If we really care about the future, we need a different vocabulary. And I know there are people out there who needs to hear that. Let's just change the vocabulary. If you really care about the people in this region, if you really care about Shany and Ahmed and Alex, and even you who lives up here in Norway for some reason, we need to change the vocabulary. If we genuinely care about the future of the Middle East, we need to become much more better listener to the lived experiences. We need nuance, we need curiosity, and I think we need to change. We need to understand that this really matters. Kos and Chaos is a small Jewish organization, but we are small, but we do a lot of things. We really exhaust ourselves. But we really care about the 7 million of our Jewish people who lives in Israel. We're like 15 million people in the world, and 7 million of them happen to be refugees and people who ended up living in Israel. The well-being of our brothers and sisters in Israel depends on the well-being of our Palestinian neighbors. So tonight, I want to officially thank our amazing, incredible partners, Oslo Freedom Forum, to be able to host such a night. This is not the first and the last night you will see in this series. We'll have a lot of this type of conversations and we want you, all of you, to go back home and bring for the next conversation all of your friends who needs to change the vocabulary about the Middle East. So thank you very much for being here. And if you have any good ideas of what you want to bring to the next conversation, write us an email. We are at kosandchaos.org. Thank you very much.